Okay, now let's talk about the different kinds of sources that historians consider when they're attempting to come up with historical conclusions or theses about the past. There are three kinds of sources, and here's some vocabulary words that you probably should be familiar with if you want to understand how history is done. The first is called a primary source. The second is called a secondary source. And the third is a tertiary source. Primary, secondary, and tertiary. Now let's go through each one individually. Primary sources are historians, usually their favorite kind of source, because a primary source is a piece of evidence, a writing, a document, an artifact that was produced at the same time as the event that you're studying. We use the word contemporaneous to mean at the same time. And so a primary source is usually the oldest source pertaining to that event. However, it's not always the best source because a primary source is uninterpreted. In other words, the author of that source, even though was a witness, an eyewitness to the event, may have been very, very biased. The integrity of the source may be under question. Even though it's older than perhaps a more reliable source, it's not always a better source. The next kind of source we call the secondary source. And a secondary source is information that's provided on the grounds of a collection of primary sources. A secondary source might be, for example, an article that I wrote about an event that occurred. I went and I looked at all of the primary sources, and then I distilled them, I interpreted them, and then I provided a historical conclusion based on the primary sources. My article would be called a secondary source. And then we have the third one is called a tertiary source. And a tertiary source is an article or perhaps a conclusion that's provided on the grounds of secondary sources. Somebody may have gone and read my article, and then they read somebody else's article who wrote about the same set of primary sources, and then a third person's article, and then that person combined the secondary sources and wrote a tertiary source. An encyclopedia article, a Wikipedia article, generally fits into the category of the tertiary source, and it is a little bit more removed from the original event. The primary sources being closest, the secondary sources being secondarily closest, and the tertiary being the furthest away. Does that mean that the primary sources are the best, secondary second best, and tertiary worst? Not necessarily, just depending on the integrity with which each is written and understood. So now let's just real quick review. We've been talking about the difference between the historical method, the scientific method. We've talked about forensic evidence, and now we've talked about different kinds of sources. So what kind of sources, what kind of evidence do we use to determine a fact, a historical fact or a historical theory? Let's take something as simple as this. How do you know that you went to kindergarten? If I came to you and asked the question, prove to me you went to kindergarten, how do you know that you went there? What could you do? Well, you would have, we've talked about this already, you would have your memory. You would say, I remember it. I remember the classroom. I remember my teacher. You might even be able to draw some documentation. You might have a report card from that time. You might be able to draw a photograph of you in your kindergarten class with all of your friends and your peers sitting around you. You might actually be able to do a little bit of forensic evidence and go back and find something in your classroom, I think it would be rather difficult, that has your DNA on it, that couldn't have been put there unless you were there when you were in kindergarten, something along those lines. So a challenge to you. How would you, if you were challenged to prove you went to kindergarten, how would you do it? And if you know how you would do it, you have learned the art of historical method. You understand how historical method is done. We need to know that for this course. We need to understand historical method, and I think we've gotten close to a good start on that process.